Thank you again for showing up tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight for a very special occasion. We wanted a very special lecture, and we got him. Tonight, Richard Van Loon, Professor Van Loon, is going to talk about one character in his quest for information about early Canadian explorers, and that is David Thompson, for whom the Thompson River is named, as I recall. Professor Van Loon got as past president of Carleton University and past chair of the Council of Ontario Universities. He holds a BSc in chemistry and an MA in political science from Carleton University and a PhD in political studies from Queen's University. And tonight he's going to have a somewhat longer, but certainly just as interesting talk about David Thompson. Professor Van Loon.
Okay, well, thank you, Warren. I hope that my face is now up there on the screen. And before I go, I just want to before we set out, I just want to mention three things. First of all, this, I think, as many people know, is the last session that Warren and Mel are going to do for the Almonte lectures. And I want to say a personal word of thanks and a tribute to them. This is the third one of these I've done, and it's been a real pleasure to work with both of you. It's comforting to have you involved in these talks, and it's just been a joy. So Mel and Warren, thank you so much on my behalf. Others will thank you, I'm sure, on their behalf. Secondly, the talk, as Warren kind of warned you, runs about an hour and a quarter. So that's a fairly long trip. Fortunately, it's on Zoom, so you people can slip out if needed. It's not so good for me, but that gives you something that I haven't got. At third, just excuse me, a quick word about sources. There are a couple of good modern biographies of David Thompson. Oddly enough, the best one of them is an American one. And the very best thing to watch, if you're interested in further information about David Thompson, is a documentary which is done by the Seattle public television station, KSPS. And you're going to see their call letters actually on a couple of my slides, because I've used some screenshots from their documentary. I can give a reference to it to Warren tomorrow, and then you can follow from that. But if you wanted to find it, you just put in KSPS David Thompson, and you're going to find an hour-long documentary about his particular time in the Northwestern United States. But it's a marvelous job, and it's kind of an irony to me, I guess, that the best biography and the best documentary about David Thompson are both American. They're both from the Northwestern United States, where he's held in very, very high regard. All right, so this talk is the third one in a series describing voyages of European trader explorers in the 17th and 18th century, and into that part of North America, which eventually became Western Canada. The first one focused actually on Eastern Canada, was on Samuel Champlain's first voyage up the Ottawa River in 1611. The second one, you might recall, was Alexander Mackenzie's famous voyage across the continent to the Pacific Ocean in 1793. To them, and to David Thompson too, all of this was new and hard travel. But we need to remember that to the First Nations, these travels were not novel, or maybe even unusually hard, except for the fact that they were dragging a European explorer along with them, because the land, significant portions of which we must acknowledge are still subject to unceded Aboriginal rights, was already very well known to them. So never forget, as I talk, that these voyages would not have been possible without the support of those First Nations in the times we were talking about, this was still their land. Now, we're going to have the exciting moment where we move to screen sharing. And in the Zoom world, of course, as most of you who've seen presentations before in it know, this is always a dramatic moment, but I'm going to go to screen share now. And there we go. And you should be looking at most of a screen, and now you should be looking at pretty much all of a screen, which features a picture. And remember, I mentioned the KSPS documentary, where you see this white arrow here. That tells you that this was actually a screenshot from that documentary. Well, today's story is a bit different than my first two, because they ended in immediate triumph. The man in the cover slide today, this is the cover slide, was called Cuckoo Sint by the Salish nations, with whom he spent many years and many miles. And they named him that for his constant surveying. It means the man who looks at stars. And we will be covering not just David Thompson's most important explorations, but also the time afterwards, when this man, who is now often recognized as Canada's greatest geographer and mapmaker, and his lifelong companion, Charlotte, were nearly forgotten. The second slide is a wee bit of background, which is possibly familiar to those of you who heard my talk about Alexander Mackenzie. I don't want to spend long on it. It just shows the progress of European traders across what is now Canada. So on the right-hand side of the picture, you can see this is the progress up to where we get to Lake Winnipeg. This is all progress of French-Canadian explorers. In the north, these are explorers and travelers from the Hudson's Bay Company, which we're not going to be talking about today. And then over on the far west of the picture, remember Mackenzie's famous voyage to the Arctic Ocean and his much more famous voyage to the Pacific Ocean in 1793. And down in the corner, Simon Fraser's travel down the river, which is now named after him, and David Thompson's travels in the Northwest. Now, that slide, that picture hugely underestimates David Thompson's travels. This one shows all 80,000 kilometers of him. This was by far the most of any European trader explorer. And Thompson mapped most of them with remarkable accuracy. So much so that his Great Map of the West, to which we'll be returning later, but which was made before 1820, was basically the go-to map for the west part of North America for much of the 19th century. Now, obviously, we can't cover anything like all of his travels. So after a little bit more preliminary, we're going to focus on just two of them. Thompson has often been called Canada's greatest geographer and mapmaker. I certainly use that term. To get some idea why, let's just look at this picture. On the left-hand side is a map of North America made just prior to the start of the 19th century. And look at the West. It's basically blank. On the right is a map made in 1820, just 20 some odd years later. It's very different. And most of that difference is due to Thompson's work. The accurate position of the first mountain range, which is the Rockies, all of the myriad of rivers that comprise the Columbia system and the Fraser system and the rivers further north, they're all due either to Thompson's own travel or to his very accurate mapping, incorporating the rougher work of earlier or other European traders and explorers. So in fact, almost a quarter of North America was initially mapped following directly from his work. Now, let's learn a little bit more about Thompson himself. He was born in 1770 in Westminster, which was then a suburb of London. His father died when he was 2, and the family was left destitute. When he was 7, he was fortunate enough to be admitted to the Gray Coat Hospital. That's not because he was sick. The Gray Coat Hospital was a school. It was a charitable school which took in poor boys of promise. It still exists today, same building. It's a Church of England school for girls, and up on the top you see a plaque which marks the fact that David Thompson was a student there. Really important, it was a good school, and it provided an excellent foundation in math and in writing in the sense of expressing yourself. It was also a Church of England school, and it was devoted to teaching the beliefs of the Church of England. And Thompson really absorbed these. So it provided a religious devotion which he retained for all of his life. And when we get to quoting Thompson later on, you'll see what I mean. Well, his education made him attractive to the Hudson's Bay Company. And he was recruited at age 14. And set out immediately on the Hudson's Bay ship Prince Rupert for Hudson's Bay. After a long and, you can bet, cold voyage, the Prince Rupert docked September 1st at a trading post which was 5 miles up the Churchill River from Prince of Wales Fort. The rebuilt fort, which in its day guarded the mouth of the Churchill River, it's now a national park site at very close to Churchill, Manitoba. And of course, it's shown here on the left. An idea of what the landing would have looked like at the actual trading post is shown on the right. So supplies and the trading post and trade goods were unloaded. The year's crop of furs was loaded, and the Prince of Wales rapidly set out for England to avoid winter. A little later on, Thompson wrote of that time, and I'm quoting from his writings, "While the ship remained at anchor, my parent and friends appeared only a few weeks distance. But when the ship sailed, and from the top of the rocks I lost sight of her, the distance became immeasurable, and I bade a sad farewell to my noble, my sacred country, an exile forever." And he was. He never returned to England. Well, Thompson, he remained with the Hudson's Bay Company for 13 years before he left, rather suddenly, to join the Northwest Company. I want to concentrate on his Northwest Company years, but we can't ignore one major event during his time with the Hudson's Bay Company. In the winter of 1787-88, so when he was 17 and then 18 years old, Thompson was stationed on the Saskatchewan River. But just before Christmas, he fell and he badly broke his leg. So badly that he had to spend a whole year recovering at Cumberland House, which you see here, which was a major Hudson's Bay Company post. Well, that sounds awful, but Thompson describes this time as a most fortunate break, because while he was recovering, Philip Turnor, Turnor, who was the foremost surveyor and cartographer of the Hudson's Bay Company at that time, arrived for the winter. Thompson had always been keen on mapping, and Turnor taught him a lot more. And soon he was able to produce results which so impressed the committee, that is the head honchos in London, that they gave him a substantial raise and a collection of the latest in surveying instruments. And they covered it with a note saying, "If you continue to make yourself useful to us, you shall not fail of further encouragement." But while he was considered a success by the Hudson's Bay Company, its main purpose was to trade for furs, not to explore and not to map. So there was always tension between Thompson and the company. Well, he held on for another 6 years, but after another 6 years, and without proper notice, you were supposed to give a year's notice if you were going to leave the company. without proper notice, he defected, that's the Hudson's Bay Company term, or chose a more important opportunity, that was his term, and he simply walked across the Saskatchewan River to a Northwest Company post and joined that company. I should point out it was winter, the river was frozen. He was a remarkable explorer, but he was not able to walk on water. Well, the Northwest Company was very different than the Hudson's Bay Company. It was more entrepreneurial. It was interested in expansion. In truth, it was a much better fit for his ambition. So he soon, in the summer of 1797, found himself at Grand Portage, the Northwest Company supply depot on Lake Superior. And he wrote of that point, quote, "The agents and partners who had been making decisions about a vast enterprise without accurate maps were anxious to know the exact positions on the globe of their many settlements for trade and their distances from each other. So my engagement was clerk, astronomer, and surveyor," which of course was perfect for a young man interested in exploration and mapping. Well, the US-Canada boundary had been set by the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolution in 1783. And Britain had agreed to soon vacate any of its posts in American territory. So Thompson was sent out immediately on the first of what turned out to be an epic journey to clarify the border between Lake Superior and the prairies and determine the exact location of Hudson's Bay Company posts and routes. So he set out in the summer of 1797 on a huge loop. Now, he's setting out from Fort William, so it's here. And in the next few months, several months, he's going to go west to the Lake of the Woods, up the east side of Lake Winnipeg, down part of the west side of Lake Winnipeg, around Lake Winnipegosis, out onto the prairies to visit several posts, down through much of the rest of the prairies. And we'll just stop for the moment here because he paused for a few days in the middle of the Assiniboine Cree territory before he was going to go further south to visit the Mandan Indian villages, because that was an important trading connection for the Northwest Company. Well, he completed the northern part of the voyage by early winter, and then he traded with the local Cree and Assiniboine First Nations for sled dogs. He built sledges. He recruited 10 voyageurs to go with his own 2 men. He had 2 men that always traveled with him. And he set out southward. Here and pretty much everywhere else, Thompson and his own men tended to walk 2 or 3 miles ahead of the rest because Thompson respected the voyageurs. He got along with them. He liked them, but he also found them abominably noisy, especially if one added several teams of dogs. So they are setting out south with Thompson and his 2 guys in the lead, the voyageurs following with the dogs. This was a dangerous route. Going south doesn't look so dangerous, but it was. Partly because it crossed Sioux First Nation territory, but mostly because it was winter. At first, it was bitterly cold. He reports that it was as low as 37 degrees below zero. That's Fahrenheit, because that's what they used. That sounds awful, but actually that was okay, because if it's that cold, the snow is hard, well packed, and not hard to walk on. But then on December 5th, the temperature rose to near freezing, so soft snow, trouble, and a furious gale struck. And Thompson wrote, "All around us a boundless plain, and our guide could not say where we were. Our situation was alarming, and anxiety was on the face of every man, for we do not know to which hand to turn ourselves for shelter." Well, so he mounted, obviously they're using horses at this point. He mounted and rode to a slight elevation, and he could see nothing but a few dark specks on the horizon. Well, maybe they were trees, but it was now dark. They had to keep going because they were exposed if they stayed where they were. They had to shout to maintain contact. But finally, yes, some trees and shelter. It took them 6 hours to cover 13 miles. To me and probably a few others in this on this trip, that actually sounds like not a bad pace, but to them that was an extremely slow pace. But they were safe for the moment, so they camped. But they remained in that camp for 5 days, waiting for the temperature to drop again. Finally, the temperature dropped back down to 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Excuse me. So gave them solid footing. And there was only a gentle south wind, so they thought it was safe to carry on. What they had to do was cross 22 miles of bare prairie. Well, no. Very soon, there was a renewed southerly gale. And Thompson writes, with high drift and dark weather, so much so that I had to keep my compass in my hand, for I could not trust the wind. It was wobbling around in front of him, I guess, so he couldn't just walk against the wind. By noon, it was a perfect storm, and we had no alternative but to proceed, which we did slowly and with great labor, for the storm was ahead and the snowdrift in our faces. Night came on. I could no longer see the compass. The weather became milder with small rain, but the storm continued. Some of the men called to lie down where we were, just a remark in brackets, which would have been fatal, to lie down where we were. But we continued, and soon, thank good Providence, my face struck against some oak saplings. A fire was quickly made. As yet, the only one with me was my servant, and we anxiously awaited the others. They came, hardly able to move, one and then another, till 9 had arrived. But one man with a sled and the dogs were missing. We were at a loss, and then we thought we heard his voice. The storm was still raging. We extended ourselves within call of each other. The most distant man heard him plainly. We went to him, raised him up, and with assistance brought him to the fire. It was now 4 degrees above freezing. In a little more than 12 hours, a difference in temperature of 56 degrees. I had weathered many a hard gale, but this was the most distressing day I had yet seen. But they had almost reached the Mandan villages. Now, the Mandan, as I mentioned, was a large First Nations community with important trading contacts. This is just part of the community, actually, but there were 3,000 people in this particular area. He was greatly impressed with the Mandan, with their structures, possibly not with their boats. I guess they hadn't. They didn't build pointed canoes, which seemed to work better for us. But it was a remarkably well-connected community. It had good trading connections, and it actually had solid agricultural capability as well. He was also impressed, negatively, I should say, devout Christian that he was, with the sexual promiscuity of the Mandan. For he soon discovered that the real reason that he'd been able to easily recruit 10 men to make the difficult voyage from farther north was the opportunities they knew they would find among the Mandan women. And Thompson wrote, "This the men with me knew, and I found it was almost the sole motive for their journey here too." Still, He considered this portion of the voyage a success because he'd made the contacts they needed to make, and once again he was mapping an area which the maps hadn't yet covered. So we're now down at the Mandan Indian villages here, and it is deep winter. Heads back up north to the junction where he had taken off to the south for, over to Fort Garry. Another part of his objective in this trip was to try to find the headwaters of the Mississippi. So south he went again and across the prairies towards where he thought he would find the headwaters of the Mississippi. Here are the actual headwaters of the Mississippi at a small lake called Lake Athabasca. He missed it. He did hit the very high port of the Mississippi River. Whether that was intentional or not, he doesn't say in his notes, but Thompson was not a man who would admit mistakes, so we won't know whether this was a mistake or not. But he continued another 500 kilometers, or the grand total across the American prairie actually is 500 kilometers here, to a Northwest Company post at the tip of Lake Superior. I don't know whether you would be tired or not, but I would be, but he wasn't. He still wasn't done. At this point, he exchanged his canoes. At this point, they were canoes de Nord, for a boat with sails and oars. And in 9 more days, he and his people traveled across and mapped the south shore of Lake Superior, ending up at Sault Ste. Marie. So down here at Sault Ste. Marie. Altogether, since the previous autumn, he'd covered nearly 6,400 kilometers. Alexander Mackenzie was at Sault Ste. Marie when Thompson got there, and Mackenzie took one look at what Thompson had done, and Mackenzie wrote in his journal, "He has performed more in 10 months than I expected could be done in 2 years." Well, by now, I guess you should have the picture. This guy was unstoppable. We're going to have to skip a lot of what he did, of course, if we're going to fit this in anything like an hour and 15 minutes, to be honest. But we can't skip his marriage because this was a very important part of his life. He was promptly sent northwest again. I need to get to another map here. Okay, so this is our larger scale map, and he was promptly sent northwest again from Sault Ste. Marie, following the north shore of Lake Superior, and then up to, he's heading for the Athabasca. He's been assigned to spend the next few years in the Athabasca trading. It's up here. Those of you who were with us with Alexander Mackenzie, remember this was Alexander Mackenzie's base area. So this is where Thompson is headed. But on the way, he has to pass through Ile à la Crosse, a very important junction point because it's very close to the Methy Portage, which separates the rivers that flow into Hudson's Bay from the rivers that flow into the Arctic Ocean. Well, Ile à la Crosse is a large Cree and Dene settlement. And as he passed through there, he met the 13-year-old daughter of another trader, Charlotte Small. He stayed only a day, but he seems to have been thoroughly smitten. And so after a winter of trading in the Athabasca, he managed to make his next trading and mapping trip end at Ile à la Crosse. He arrived there on May 20th, and by June 10th, David Thompson and Charlotte Small were married in the Cree fashion, which means that each of them consented, her mother agreed, and it was done. He was 29, she was 13. Certainly not statutorily legal today, but that's not so unusual in those days. And their marriage lasted 67 years, which appears to have been the longest marriage in Canada pre-Confederation. By the autumn of 1800, Charlotte, who was now all of 14, was pregnant with the first of their 13 children. And of Charlotte, Thompson wrote, "My lovely wife is of the blood of these people, speaking their language, and well educated in the English language, which gives me great advantage." It did. It gave him a great trading advantage and a great set of connections to First Nations. Now, we're going to jump forward 7 years to 1807. In the interim, David Thompson and Charlotte Small have been posted in the Athabasca for 4 years. They already have 3 children, and Thompson has become a full partner in the Northwest Company. Meanwhile, the Northwest Company, has developed a strong interest in finding a way to get furs out through the mountains to the Pacific. And clearly the route that Alexander Mackenzie followed was not satisfactory. It was just plain too difficult. The mouth of the Columbia has been discovered by sea, located on maps, and it's obviously a very large river, so it seems the best way to go if a passable route to it can be found. But its upper reaches are unknown. And until Simon Fraser descended the river, which is now named after him, which was in 1808, it was still thought possible that the Fraser River was actually the Columbia River. And it's also important that there were major unexploited trading opportunities, fur trading opportunities, in the interior valleys of the Cordillera. Well, who better for this job than the Northwest Company's greatest explorer and mapper, as recognized by this time, and also one who gets along better with First Nations than almost anybody else among them. So, in the spring of 1807, we find David Thompson with a large crew and his family moving up the North Saskatchewan River and intending to cross the first range of the mountains, that is the Rockies, which is the first range, on a route which is now called the Howes Pass. And Thompson writes, "A very fine day. At 10, we set off on horseback, when, with very hard riding through thick woods, very much fallen down, we arrived at the round plain." The picture on the right is probably not a bad representation of what they were trying to ride through, because the trails were certainly not well marked at that time in that area. It was also very early spring, so the mountains were reverberating day and night with thunder of avalanches. But by early June, they had traveled 75 miles and they were in the Kootenay Plains. So the Kootenay Plains are here. You can, just for orienting yourself, down here is Calgary, okay? Down in the, let's call it the southeast corner of the map. And the Kootenay Plains are much further up north, and that's where the Howes Pass is as well. They are flatlands on the upper Saskatchewan River, but they're within the mountains themselves. So they pass through some mountains, as I just mentioned, and they're now on a nice area in the inside the mountain, for early part of the mountains. Well, they waited 3 weeks there for the snows to melt in the higher passes, and then they set out to cross the pass itself. It was an easy climb to the summit, but the descent, which is on a river called the Blaeberry River, was something else. On the left-hand slide is actually a picture of the Blaeberry River in flood. And Thompson wrote of that time, "The water, descending in innumerable rills, soon swelled our brook to a rivulet, with a current foaming white. The horses with difficulty crossed and recrossed at every 200 or 300 yards, and the men crossed by clinging to the tails and manes of the horses, and yet ran no small danger of being swept away and drowned. Still, children and all, they survived, and at the bottom, they actually were on the banks of the Columbia River. But so let's just go there. So this is the top, it's right up at the top of the picture here. This is the bottom part of the Howes Pass and the Blaeberry River, and they have come down there, and this is actually the Columbia River Valley. There was not a highway there, but there they were on the Columbia River. However, Thompson didn't recognize it because at this point, the Columbia River is flowing north. It flows in a huge loop in British Columbia, about 300 or 400 kilometers on each side of the loop. So at this point, it's flowing north before it does a U-turn and flows south. But Thompson didn't recognize it, and he set out going south because he knew that's where the mouth of the Columbia must be, which means he's going upstream on the Columbia River. For Charlotte and the children, all of this must have been a very daunting adventure, but Thompson actually seldom mentions them, which I guess to be charitable is a tribute to Charlotte's ability to move with the family in this exceptionally difficult environment. Or maybe he was focused on other things, but anyway, she did a wonderful job, obviously, of getting them through. Well, they struggled 200 kilometers upriver with very little food in this stretch, okay? Because these were prairie men and they were unused to finding food in the mountains. And they were saved only when some of the Kootenai First Nation, led by their most important chief, arrived and provided food. Now, the Kootenai, who pronounced their native name Katunaha, who are the predominant First Nation inside the first ranges of mountains, were then and still are, were led at that time by their most important headman, who was named by them Ugly Head. And he was called Ugly Head by his people because he had curly hair, which was a rarity among his people. Well, we're going to return to Ugly Head more than once. He was crucial to Thompson's success because he seemed to know almost every important person and every bit of terrain in the whole vast area in which Thompson wanted to trade, explore, and map. And he and Thompson obviously formed a bond because he was willing to vouch for Thompson all the time. And it's interesting that Ugly Head's fame still lives on among his people. There are still people among the South Kootenai First Nation who proudly claim Ugly Head is their ancestor. Well, they built a post, Kootenai House, and a stockade to defend against the pagan First Nation. The pagan, who were the largest and most warlike of the members of the Blackfoot Confederacy, controlled a long stretch of the eastern Rockies and the foothills. And they did not like the Northwest Company trading with the Kootenai, who were their traditional rivals. For now, at least, they were somewhat menacing, but they didn't directly attack Thompson and his people, probably because Thompson had spent a year with the Blackfoot when he was with the Hudson's Bay Company, and he could speak their language. I should point out, too, that Kootenai House is gone. He didn't keep it as a post for very long, so this is an artist's rendition. There is a plaque, and you can see it on the left-hand side there, which marks the location of Kootenai House. And on a map, which is the upper part of the Columbia River, I've shown where it is located. And I'll come back to the map in a second. But, well, actually, I'll come back to it right now because let's just stop here and say that Kootenai House is on Windermere Lake. Windermere Lake is drained into by Columbia Lake, which, not surprisingly, is the headwater of the Columbia River. And by, I guess, an interesting fluke of nature, there is a very short portage here between the top of Columbia Lake and the Kootenai River. It's a short and easy portage, which is now called the Canal Flats. So here's the Kootenai River. Here's the bottom of the top of the Columbia River, and the Kootenay River just goes right on by and carries on. Now, the Kootenay River is the second most important tributary of the Columbia River, but it flows, it's within 2 miles here, but it flows another 500 kilometers before it actually meets the Columbia River at Lake Kootenay. Well, Thompson and company wintered at Kootenay House in at least moderate comfort rather. And I think because they were helped a lot by the Kootenay. And by mid-April, Thompson was ready to go south on the Kootenay River because it's flowing south. So that gave him a break to go south. And he was hoping to trade. He left Charlotte and the family at Kootenay House, and he writes, "Gummed the canoes and got all ready to be off the morrow morning. Please heaven, thank God for his good protection." Remember that religious devotion? It keeps popping up. Anyway, off he went with 4 men in a large canoe down the Kootenay. 200 miles south, so 300 kilometers south, past the 49th parallel, which it wasn't the border at the time. Kootenay, Thompson actually observed it and mapped it, but it wasn't particularly important for the border at the time. All of that was quite easy paddling, but then the river turned west and dropped into a narrow gorge, which is still there, and it's called the Kootenay Falls. And Thompson writes, "We began carrying at 3:15 p.m. That is 3:15. That's the way he wrote it. We began carrying at 3:15 p.m. with light loads at about 1 mile over a terrible road alongside of a steep hill, nearly perpendicular, walking wholly among small fragments of broken rock that had rolled from the summit. Our height at times was about 300 feet above the river, ascending and descending as steep rocks obliged us. The least slip would have been inevitable destruction, as the steepness of the rock allowed of no return, or if once falling, to stop until precipitated into the river." Well, as I mentioned, Kootenay Falls is still there. And so what you're looking at here is on the right-hand side, a slightly doctored photograph of people actually passing over the portage, but you can see what they were dealing with. And from a distance, this is a picture from the KSPS documentary that I mentioned earlier, what the portage looks like if you're looking at it from the other side. So when he talks about a terrifying possibility of plunging into the falls, I think you can see what I mean. They had to go back and forth over that portage 6 times to carry all their equipment across. They did it. And eventually, after another 50 miles, and fortunately meeting Ugly Head again because they were out of food again, they arrived at what we now call Lake Kootenay. And it was the camp of the First Nation, which at that time were called the Flatbow First Nation because of their bows. And that is the group which is now the South Kootenay Band of the Kootenay First Nation. I have to point out here that this is also the location of the former Saint Eugene residential school, where at least 182 unmarked graves were found this year. They probably weren't all former students, but because the cemetery was also used by the community, but undoubtedly many of them were students from the South Kootenay First Nation. There's a kind of fitting end to that story. Was not an end, but a waypoint, because the school was closed in 1972, and the building, which is obviously much refitted, is now actually a small casino and a golf course, which belongs to the South Kootenay First Nations. So, anyway, this was intended as a trading mission. It was only moderately successful, but nonetheless, Thompson had to return. not in this case, not just back to Kootenai House, but all the way back across the prairies to Rainy Lake, about 3,500 kilometers, because that's where he had to go to take the furs for which he had traded over the winter. Well, you can see if you look at this map and follow my arrow, Kootenai House was up here. The route they had followed to get to the village of the Flatbow was down the Kootenai River, west through the Kootenai Falls, and back up into here. Now, if Thompson wanted to go back, he would have to go upriver all the way against the stream in the Kootenai River, and it was still spring. So it seemed to him that the best idea was to go cross country to get to the Kootenai River. Well, Uglyhead had crossed that trail in the fall. So there's a trail there. But in the fall, there's no snow, it's dry weather. But now it was spring. The rivers in the area were flooded. The woods are still deep in snow. Well, as I mentioned, Thompson's pretty unstoppable, so undaunted, he set out anyway with 4 men. And I guess you could say at best a very reluctant guide who abandoned them on the 3rd day in the middle of a very difficult wilderness. And Thompson wrote in his journal that night, "Passed the evening reflecting on our forlorn situation without a guide, path, or provisions in these rugged mountains." He's desperate. He sent 2 of his men back to the Flatbow camp to beg for help. And I need a drink of water while they're doing that trip. Well, 2 days later, and there should be a drum roll here or a trumpet call or something, because the men returned with Uglyhead. And Thompson writes, "I thank God, for my anxiety of my situation was great, and now entirely relieved, for I knew the manly character of the Lake Indian chief and justly placed confidence in him." Well, at that, the rest of the trip was extremely difficult. They lost part of their trade furs and 2 of the men were injured. But after 8 more days, they had reached the Kootenai River, so they're over here. They went up the Kootenai River to Kootenai House, and they set out to go back to the prairies with the family and the furs. Well, this is a difficult passage in itself because they had to go back up the Blaeberry River and back up through the Howse Pass. And it was all made all the more terrifying because their 3-year-old daughter, Emily, went missing for 8 hours at the top of the Howse Pass. And of that time, Thompson wrote, "At 3 p.m., we reloaded, but missing my little daughter and nowhere finding her, we concluded she was drowned, and all of us set about finding her. We searched all the log jams in the river, but to no purpose. At length, Mr. McDonald found her track going upwards. We searched all about, and at length, thank God, at 8:30 p.m., we found her, about 1 mile off against a bank of snow." Well, they completed the passage out to the prairies, and I think, not surprisingly, since she had a rapidly growing family and probably understood that her husband, David Thompson, would travel on almost no matter what, Charlotte never crossed the mountains again. Well, now we need to make another leap forward from 1808 to 1810. And in the meantime, Thompson has not exactly been idle. He spent 2 years trading and mapping south of Kootenai House, so he's been trading and mapping down in this area. He's established 3 trading posts, Cooley Spell House, Spokane House, and Salish House. The area is vast, but it was quite well settled at the time by First Nations. So while the travel here was novel to the Europeans, well, it was very much settled territory for the First Nations. But this is on the right-hand side is Thompson's map made of the area at the same time at that time. And on the left-hand side, of course, is a more modern map. And just take a second with this. So if we look at Thompson's map, we see that what he calls Cullyspell Lake, and you go over here, it was Cullyspell House. It's now called Pondorai Lake, but his shape of the lake, his depiction of the lake is exactly accurate. Okay. If you go further south, what he called Skeetshoe Lake is now Lake Coeur d'Alene. And again, it's completely accurate in its depiction. Another thing to know, and one other point, over here is his location of Spokane House, okay? And then over here, it's over here. Spokane House is the location of Spokane, Washington. Spokane, I should pronounce it the American way. Spokane, Washington. So David Thompson is actually the founder of Spokane, Washington. Also, see these dotted lines on his map? Those are First Nation roads. He didn't call them trails, he called them roads. They're well traveled by the First Nations. If you look at the highways in that area today, that's where the highways are. So the highway routes were most certainly not discovered by European travelers. They were discovered by First Nations, and they were used by them for thousands of years, probably before Thompson ever got there. But he accurately mapped them, and the accuracy of his mapping is really quite remarkable. By the spring of 1810, after he'd successfully traded in that area for 2 years, Thompson was entitled to a sabbatical. That is a leave, which he intended to spend partly in Montreal, visiting his eldest daughter, who was attending school back east. Another aside, it's important that Thompson was devoted to his family and his children, and all of the substantial money that he was receiving as a Northwest Company partner was going to providing for his family, including education in the East for his children. Well, when he got back to excuse me, when he got back to Rainy Lake, which was a main depot in the east for the Northwest Company, he learned, certainly to his dismay, that his Northwest Company partners wanted him to go back west and finally get down to the mouth of the Columbia, hopefully to secure the territory for the Northwest Company and British North America, because the border in that area was unsettled at the time. And so whoever could accurately map the area would have a prior claim to that territory. As well, he was to meet a ship from New York, which had been sent to the mouth of the Columbia River by none other than John Jacob Astor, the famous rich John Jacob Astor, who maybe was forming a partnership with the Northwest Company. So he headed back on what would be his last and most prodigious voyage. But then, as he and his crew approached the mountains west of the prairies, he learned of a major problem. The pagan were not going to allow anyone through Howe's Pass. The Northwest Company was stalled. A new route was obviously necessary. Well, it seemed to present itself when one of Thompson's guides, who's known to history only as Thomas the Iroquois, told him of a route that had been followed by some adventurous Nipissing and Iroquois free traders. But to do that, they had to travel 120 miles northwest into the Athabasca River Valley, and then across the Rockies into the Valley of the Columbia, far north of where Thompson had first accessed it in 1807. So again, on a map to give you a picture of where we are, in the south where my arrow is now. Here's the Howes Pass route. Okay. What he had to do was get up here. This is actually, you can't see it here in this map, but this is the Athabasca River. He had to get up here to go across what he hoped would be a pass, because this was basically a rumor, and take him across into the north part of the Columbia River. It became to be called, it was successful, obviously, came to be called the Athabasca Pass, and eventually became the main route for the Northwest Company into the mountains and to the west. But he was way over here, where my arrow, past where my arrow is, on the prairies. And instead of going on a simple trip up the Saskatchewan River to here, he had to go across through a range of mountains just to get to the Athabasca River. Well, he assembled a large party, a good supply of trade goods, and they set out. 24 men, 3 wives, sometimes they traveled with wives, 24 pack horses, and 6,000 pounds of goods. And they're setting out north over, I can't even mark it on the map, but it was an old Assiniboine First Nation trail, but by then it was pretty thoroughly overgrown towards the Athabasca River. Not only that, but the hunting was poor. So the food was scarce. It was nothing like the 8 pounds of meat that's required each day by voyageurs. So they were already in a bad mood when they finally, after 30 days, reached the Athabasca River. And they were still about 50 miles from the top of the pass. Well, they stayed there for about 4 weeks, building equipment for the crossing. Then they set out with pack horses and dogs to haul the goods. It was December 28th. It was bitterly cold, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The summit, to Thompson at least, was lovely. He writes about it in his journals and declares it to have been beautiful. I don't think it was to the men. In any event, the descent was really perilous. And this was really tough going for men used to the prairies. In fact, the trail was so steep, they started out with horses, but the trail was so steep that eventually they couldn't use the horses at all, and they had to proceed with only dogs. And some of the prairie men were freaked out by this new environment, and they saw the footprints of a large grizzly bear, and some of them decided that these were the footprints of woolly mammoths. And if woolly mammoths were about, they were truly terrified. Meanwhile, just to compound problems, the cold had changed on the west side of the mountains to a thaw, and the snow was wet and it was heavy. And Thompson wrote, "The courage of part of my men is sinking fast. They see nothing in its proper color. The soft weather is a thing it seems they never felt before. But when men arrive in a strange country, fear gathers on them from every object. Junord, one of his men, with some of the prairie men, having long been dispirited, a useless as old women, told me he would return back over the pass." Thompson agreed, and I think was probably very happy to see him go. Well, it was January 1811. They have come, following in this left-hand picture, down the Athabasca Pass Trail. Still there, the Athabasca Pass Trail is still there. It's not particularly well kept, I understand. It's not something I could handle, but it is there. And when you come over down the pass, you come into a river called the Wood River, and it flows down into the Columbia River. The Columbia River at this point is, well, and at many points, is dammed. So instead of a flowing river, we have a lake, which is now called Kinbasket Lake. So he comes down over the pass, and he is now at what was then a flowing river. He still had 2 men with him, Valade and Lamoureux, and a companionable dog. He had the idea that this is January, he was going to go upstream on the Columbia towards Canal Flats and then go south into the much more congenial area that we saw on the previous maps. But in winter, this simply proved impossible. So they went back to a good flat area and built a small cabin, which he called boat encampment, where they spent the rest of the winter learning to construct cedar strip canoes. So there is a plaque on the edge of Kinbasket Lake, obviously not exactly where boat encampment was because it's flooded, but there it is, and that's generally what the view would have been like to Thompson and Valade and Lamoureux and the dog. Well, fortunately, they also found themselves in the middle of a moose wintering ground, so their food worries were over for the winter. And by spring, they'd been joined by 3 more Northwest Company men and a very, very good Cree hunter. So then on April 17th, so now it's spring, with a new canoe, they set out upstream towards Canal Flats. So on the map, this is the Athabasca Pass. They've come across there. It's now spring, and they're going to go upstream on the Columbia towards Canal Flats in about here. They are then going to cross onto the Kootenay and go down into the south area, which we saw earlier. Okay. It's still a partially frozen river, though, when they set out, and it's just coming into spring flood. The start, therefore, was really hard going. And he writes, April 18th, Thursday, a light snowy morning. Could not gum the canoe, which leaks much until 8 a.m. The whole of this day, the rapids may be said to touch each other, and most of them dangerous. We came up leading the canoe in excessive cold water, towing up with the line, at the same time on snowshoes on full 3 feet of snow, and sometimes in the water, so that we were all wet and sadly benumbed, but very hard work. So just picture that. You're on snowshoes part of the time, pulling the canoe. You have to go down into the water some of the time. You can imagine, well, the water temperature is probably about +1. Really difficult. But in the next day, they met 2 First Nation free traders who were going upstream. Actually, they were going downstream. I have that wrong. They were going downstream. These guys were known to Thompson pretty much. All the Europeans in the area knew each other. These guys were actually, there were 2 of them were First Nations. But they were excellent canoemen, and Thompson hired them. So he then had a lot more canoe power to go with him. The ice broke. The spring weather appeared. They found themselves back at the bottom of the Blaeberry River, so they're then back in a known area. And the rest of the way south into the country where Thompson had traded in and built the posts previously was well known. Well, by now, Thompson had been in the area long enough to have learned that from the local First Nations that the Columbia River could best be reached along the Spokane River, which had been used, of course, for generations by First Nations to get to the fishing grounds. And he writes, on the afternoon of the 19th June, thank God, we arrived safe at the Ilfkoiape Falls. They're now what they became called the Kettle Falls of the Columbia River. Here was a considerable village of natives. On our arrival, the chief presented us with a roasted salmon and some roots. Now, Kettle Falls is now gone, another casualty of damming of the river. But in the day, it was a major fishing ground for First Nations when the salmon run was on. So when the salmon run was on, many First Nations, different ones, would gather at this place and simply fish to try to get enough salmon to last them for much of the year. As for Thompson, well, he was now back at the Columbia with his men, and this time he was on the lower reaches of Columbia. Compared to many other parts of his travel, the voyage down the lower Columbia, mapping all the way, was for Thompson relatively benign. even though it contains several dangerous rapids. Now, the picture we're looking at now is not what Thompson would have seen. This is the Columbia after many dams had tamed it. For Thompson and company, there were a lot of rapids, but these guys are by now are very experienced canoeists, so they were able to handle them quite easily. There are many First Nations along the banks, different ones, and Thompson stopped at every one to introduce himself and make friends. That wasn't always easy because while Thompson was comfortable with Salish speakers, he was now out of the area of Salish speakers who occupied the area. Remember the big area we saw south of Kootenay House? That was all Salish speaking area. But these are not Salish speakers, so communication is more difficult. But still, he stopped, made friends, and he has really extensive notes on those communities. There's lots of really interesting information in them, but obviously we don't have time to deal with those now. On July 15th, the party reached the Pacific, and he found that there was already an American post there. It's pretty rudimentary, but it had been built by John Jacob Astor's men, and oddly enough, it was called Astoria. The situation then was kind of ambiguous because neither the people who'd come on by ship nor Thompson knew whether there had been an alliance formed between John Jacob Astor and the Northwest Company. They knew there had been discussions, but they didn't know what the result of the discussions were. So maybe they were working for the same company, maybe they weren't. In any case, everything was quite civil, especially since 3 of the men in charge of Astoria were actually former Northwest Company men. And one of them actually was Alexander Mackay, who was the other European with Alexander Mackenzie as he went to the Pacific Ocean in 1793. Well, having reached his goal, Thompson stayed about a week at Astoria, and then he returned upriver. So here's Astoria, of course, and now he's going to go back upriver. He's going upriver. He actually did a little detour into Spokane House again, and then he sets out further up the Columbia River. This is unmapped territory and untraveled territory by Europeans, of course, traveled plenty by First Nations. It's upstream all the way, and there are 15 sets of rapids between where he comes back. This is Kettle Falls, between Kettle Falls and Boat Encampment at the top of the Columbia Loop. Basically, Thompson treats this as pretty routine. He's surveying and mapping all the way, but he reached Boat Encampment in 1 month on September 18th. So what he had done between April 19th and September 18th is a giant circle all the way down here, all the way down to the mouth of the Columbia, all the way back, and up again to Boat Encampment. So 4,000 kilometers between April 19th and September 18th. Just for a little bit of information, the Columbia River itself is 2,000 kilometers long. It's big. It's the 4th largest river in North America by water volume. And just to give you some image of what it's like, it's 4 times as big as the Ottawa River. Well, with a lot of help from First Nations and Northwest Company crews as well, he covered and mapped all of it in 5 months. Of course, being David Thompson, he wasn't done yet. So he went back, this time upriver some more. No, he went back downriver, taking advantage of the fact that actually you could now go downriver. He went back downriver into this area to Salish House, which was over here, and spent the winter there trading. And then in the spring, he built 6 canoes, and he set out again upstream on the Kootenay to the Athabasca, so upstream on the Kootenay, down the Columbia again to the Athabasca Pass, and across the Athabasca Pass out to the prairies with his trade goods. He was now 41 years old. I know, to lots of us, that sounds very young, but that's really old for an explorer trader. And he'd been traveling for 19 straight months. I think it's fair to say from observing his journals that he actually was not sorry to leave the mountains. But he writes that he paused as he passed the height of the Athabasca Pass for a pipe, and he never went back again. He picked up his family at Lake Winnipeg, and they traveled to Montreal with the returning fur brigades in the fall of 1812. Now, it would be nice if we could end the story there with a happily ever after, but we can't. Thompson was less than halfway through his life, although we are way more than halfway through this talk, and much of the rest of his life was not quite so good. Another pause for a sip of water. Well, at first things went well. He had a solid nest egg from the Northwest Company shares. He and his family moved into a comfortable house in Terrebonne, which is outside Montreal. He had his country marriage formalized. This is his religious inclinations. He purchased a farm to provide extra income, and he began to work on his immense maps of all of Northwest North America. And in a year, he finished the first version using his own data and that from others such as Philip Turner and Mackenzie and Simon Fraser. And there are several copies of what is now known as the Great Map of all of Northwest. You can't really see it on this one, but and I'll come back to it in a second. But it's a map of all of North America west of Lake Superior. The most prominent copy of the map, I guess maybe in a sense the most important one, hung in Fort William, the Northwest Company's main depot, until 1881. And it was used by the Northwest Company and Hudson's Bay Company, as later became, as long as it traded across the West. Another one, and that's this one, is found today on the main wall of the reading room of the Archives of Ontario. Other segments of the map were sent to England, where they were used by major map makers of the day to fill in the maps of the Northwest that we saw earlier, but without giving much credit or any payment to David Thompson. In 1815, they moved to Williamstown in Glengarry. So many of you may have been there. Many retired Northwest Company men lived in Williamstown or near in Glengarry. And soon after moving there, they moved into what's now called the Bethune Thompson House. And it's an Ontario Heritage Trust site. So it's open for, you wouldn't visit it now, but it's open to be visited in the summer. But pretty soon he was off again. He was the principal surveyor for the Canadian half of the Boundary Commission for the Canada-US boundary along the St. Lawrence and through the Great Lakes. Finished that work in 1827. And except for the deaths of 2 children, sadly, those did happen in that time, things had gone well. He had a reputation as probably the foremost Canadian surveyor and mapper. He had a comfortable home. He owned many properties. But then he contracted to supply a large quantity of firewood to the Montreal military garrison for the winter of 1830, and the shipment was wrecked on the St. Lawrence. And making good on that contract was financially very difficult. Then a depression hit. The McGillivray Fur Company, in which he held shares, went bankrupt. And he'd lent money to a lot of people, but in a depression, they defaulted. and they left him unable to cover his own debts. He lost his properties in Glengarry, and he had to move to Montreal with Charlotte and 7 of the children. Still, he did take on further surveying, and until 1841, with difficulty, he was still able to barely provide for his family. But by 1842, he was 72 years old and in poor physical condition. His vision was failing. He could no longer survey. He was out of money. His family was in squalid quarters, and he could so little afford even those that he and Charlotte had to move in with a daughter and her husband. He'd been refused pensions by both the British government, which had made free use of his maps, and by the Hudson's Bay Company. In 1843, so when he's 73, he wrote in his journal, "I am the morrow 73 years old, but so destitute that I have not the wherewithal to buy a loaf of bread. May the pity of the Almighty be upon us." Well, he could still write. And so in 1845, he set about writing The Travels of David Thompson, which were 2 volumes of his recollections and memoir. He kept writing on and off until failing eyesight stopped him completely in 1850, and the manuscripts were not yet completed. Well, that's a picture of him, an actual picture of him on the left, and it's not an actual picture of their grave, but it's what they would have been like. He and Charlotte lived on in the home of their daughter, Eliza, until he died there in 1857 at age 87. And Charlotte outlived him by just 3 months. And they were buried obscurely in the family plot of Eliza's husband. Thompson's journals and the draft of his voyages, that is his memoir, seemed to disappear. There was no obituary anywhere, and David Thompson and Charlotte were forgotten until 1883. That year, Joseph Burr Tyrrell, who was a young clerk, I'm going to go back because I don't want to be quite at that slide yet. No, we'll leave it there. Joseph Burr Tyrrell, who was at that time a young clerk with the Geological Survey of Canada in 1883, was sent west to survey and map. And in the foothills and mountains near Calgary, he took his readings and then he compared them to older maps. And the older maps were astonishingly accurate. Well, where had they come from? Well, maybe a man named David Thompson, some of the older officials in the Geological Survey seem to remember. And some of his journals are maybe in the possession of the Ontario Department of Crown Lands. Well, Tyrrell found them, and he wrote a paper called A Brief Narrative of the Journeyings of David Thompson, which he read to the Canadian Institute in 1888. The Canadian Institute in Toronto was actually a fairly big deal, so a reading like that was not minor. And there was moderate interest. Meanwhile, Tyrrell's father had a friend, Charles Lindsay, who was a prominent Ontario literary and historical figure. And Tyrrell's father told Lindsay of his son's interest in Thompson. And amazingly, Lindsay had bought the original manuscript of the Travels from David Thompson's son in 1868. He'd hoped to publish it, but the text was a bit of a mess. And after several abortive attempts to edit it and get it published, Lindsay had given up and he gladly sold it to Tyrrell. Then, nothing. Again. For 14 years, Tyrrell was occupied with other things, like getting rich. But he also became deeply involved with the Champlain Society, which a few of you may be familiar with. The Champlain Society, which was founded in 1905, has been a major source of publication of Canadian historical documentation. And finally, after more editing, Thompson's Travels was published in 1916 by the Champlain Society to moderate interest, a print run of 520. But over the next decade, which was a time of growing Canadian nationalism and interest in our past, the story slowly got traction among journalists and historians, and soon the wider public noticed. Well, his fame has continued to increase, and now, 175 years after his and Charlotte's death, Thompson stands recognized among the most important of European explorer traders, and Charlotte, who traveled over 20,000 kilometers with Thompson, farther than any other Canadian woman of her time, has been formally acknowledged as a Canadian woman of historical significance. In the West, both Canada and the United States, Thompson and Charlotte are particularly well known as the memorials from Rocky Mountain House, that's the one in the center, à la Crosse, Saskatchewan, where he met Charlotte, that's the one at the top right, and Verendrye, North Dakota, at the bottom right, as well, they all attest. And on the left is Thompson's gravesite was moved by Joseph Bertiro, and a proper monument has been erected to him in the Mount Royal Cemetery. As for the man, well, he had a strong temper. He could be rough when he was crossed. He was obviously devoutly religious, which probably didn't endear him to some of his men. He was almost certainly not a guy you'd want to have a beer with, but in all of the at least 80,000 kilometers that he traveled and mapped, he never had a fatality among the many who worked with him. He had a strongly loyal group of Northwest Company men, most of whom stuck with him through all sorts of adversity. Aided by Charlotte, he was great at relations with First Nations. And in addition to English and French, he was fluent in Cree and probably Blackfoot. He could get along in several other First Nation languages, including Kootenai and Salish. But maybe most important of all, through his maps and his journals, he gave us a vision, which was rare in his time, of a transcontinental nation. In the roster of parents of Confederation, he and Charlotte surely must be among the most prominent members. Thanks. Back to you, Warren.
Wow, what a story. So thanks very much, Richard, for a fascinating lecture about David Thompson. As you noted, the lecture is the final one of the Almonte lectures that have been organized by my colleagues and me. But Almonte Lectures is bound to live on. A few notes. After 8 years and 56 lectures, we have decided to pass our lecture series on to a new generation of enthusiastic organizers who will coordinate the Almonte Lectures and its sister series, Learning in Almonte, under a new banner. And the new banner, as you may know, folks, is called Learning Again in Almonte. Learning Again in Almonte. They have a website, and they're putting together their series. You can visit the website and learn more about it by going to www.learningagaininalmonte is one word, .ca. I'll say it again, www.learningagaininalmonte.ca. www.learningagain.almonte. You got it. Just type in Learning in Almonte or Learning Again in Almonte on Google and it'll come up. I have to thank a lot of people for all these years that I've been working with, especially Mel Turner, who's been absolutely wonderful and reliable as our techie. Glenda Jones, who's done wonderful work publicizing our offerings, and Jan Johns, who's very kindly volunteered to help with technical issues when they arise. I don't know if it's possible to do this, but can we somehow turn all microphones on, Mel, so I can lead a round of applause?
People have to turn them on themselves. We didn't check if there were any questions for.
Oh, sorry, that all So before I say my final word, does anybody have any questions for Richard or comments?
Absolutely superb lecture. It was riveting, and I really appreciate the enormous amount of work that went into that. It was quite wonderful. Thank you.
I had a question.
Yep. Go ahead.
Yes. What do you think Ugly Head out of Thompson? Like, what was he getting out of the relationship? Here's this guy that shows up at your encampment repeatedly and always needs like food and favors. What's he getting? And it would be interesting to get kind of a biography from the side of one of the leaders in one of the Nexus First Nations communities, actually. Just like, here is what it was like to have all of these travelers, these European travelers passing through. And like on this week, we had Alex McKenzie in, and then a week later, David Thompson came by. And like, it would be
Let's start a hotel.
What he got was he controlled the First Nations side of the trade. So a lot of the trade that would go to Thompson or other Northwest companies, traders too, would actually go through Ugly Head. And so he would get access to more European trade goods than anybody else. And what he would do with them is gift them. He would, pass them out to other people in the community. And that would be the source of his power. So because he was an intermediary and because he had access to more goods than anybody else, that gave him power. So, it's just the usual story about why do people want to be the big man? Well, Ugly Head wanted to be the big man, and he was awfully good at it.
Other questions or comments?
I may have exhausted everyone.
Well, I was thinking about the sheer difficulty. I mean, you describe a journey which sounds harrowing, that would, completely overtake you. And yet somehow he manages to carry journals around with him and presumably sheets of paper to write his maps on. It sounds almost impossible.
Yeah, I'm not hearing the question. It's not quite loud enough. I don't think it's your fault, but maybe the volume on my thing isn't loud enough. So I don't know. Could you amp up your volume a bit?
Well, I'll just get a bit closer to the microphone and hope that does the trick. I'm just kind of amazed that he was actually able to carry all this paper around with him while wading through rivers. You kind of think, how on earth do you do this? And
it is amazing. And I mean, he was carrying notebooks, and you can, his notebooks are still around. So they're in the archives of Ontario, and you can see them. You have to get a special dispensation to see them because, of course, they're pretty fragile by now. But it is amazing. So when he's mapping, somebody else is paddling and he's taking notes in the canoe. And so periodically he'll stop and take a reading. And so that'll require a sun sighting or moon sighting, something that gives him a location on the river. And then as he goes, practically every inch of the way, he's writing notes about exactly how far he's gone and exactly what compass direction he's moving in. So his notebooks are just full of detail. And he's done all of this while he's sitting in a canoe. It's just astonishing how he did it. And then he seems to have been able to read them when he got back, because his maps are really excellent. So he was carrying notebooks more than anything else. And I don't imagine the weight was all that great, but what he was doing with them was just astonishing.
And he was using a pencil at the time, or what was he using as a writing instrument?
Sorry, I'm missing that too.
Is he writing with a pen and ink?
It was no, he's writing with a pencil sort of thing. And that's why it's kind of faded now too.
Yeah.
If he's using the stars, it would be a lot of nighttime work. So it would be hard to record.
Well, he would take him reading at night to get an exact fix on where he was. And then that would last him for quite a while during the day. So every night he would have to stop and take another reading if it was not cloudy, and then he would take it from there. But he was repeatedly doing readings. That's why the name Cuckoo Synth, the man who looks at stars, because he was doing it all the time. They also thought, until they got to know him and understood what he was doing, they thought he was maybe magic. And he might be a sorcerer, and so maybe he could do great things for them, like bring extra salmon into the river or something like that. Mm-hmm. But of course, eventually they understood what he was doing, and they did understand. They understood maps. If you asked them to draw a picture of where something was, they could do it. So they knew what a map was.
Well,
anyway, I have one last comment or question. Anyone want to speak up?
Yeah, the school that he went to when he was an orphan. How did they come to know about him?
That I don't know, and it's kind of miraculous, because here he is. He's a poor boy. His father wasn't anything particularly distinguished. I mean, he wasn't. He was a reasonably comfortable person, but when he died, the family went destitute. So probably in Westminster, the family was known, but that's all I can speculate. I really don't know. But what a stroke of luck.
Oh, amazing.
I guess for us too.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, it's time for some wine. I want to thank one last person in his memory. And that's Don Wiles, who started this lecture series back in 2008, I think it was.
Here.
So it's certainly been good of him to do it, and it certainly was. We benefited all. So I hope you have a good holiday. I hope to see you in the audience of future Almonte lectures. Again, if you want to know more about them, it's www.learningagain.in-Almonte, all one word, .ca.
So we definitely need to say a big thank you to you, Warren, for taking up the baton and carrying on the work that had been started by Don.
Oh, thank you, Peter. It's been my pleasure. Oh, one last thing. Oh my goodness. Sorry, I'm so nervous. I have to tell you, so you can tell anybody else you want, that the most common reaction that lecturers have had to giving lectures in the Almonte lecture series is how good the audience was. And that's what's driven many of the lecturers to say, can I give another one? So congratulations to all of you for being such a good audience. See you downtown sometime. So I'll say good night.
Yeah, thank you so much. All the best.
And thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, all the best, everybody.
All the best. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.